Chapter 1. A Garden Party and a Dollin. The quiet village of Little Witchwood, tucked between the rolling hills of Devon and shaded by age-old oaks. The arrival of summer was always marked by the same reliable event, the annual garden party at Forsyth Hall. Mrs. Eleanora Forsyth, a widow of considerable wealth and even more considerable social ambition, opened her stately gardens to the villagers once a year. Croquet was set up on the back lawn. Cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge were laid out beneath the marquee, and a local string quartet played gentle melodies near the ornamental fountain. Miss Marple arrived punctually, as always, wearing her pale lavender dress with white gloves and her straw hat adorned with a single cornflower. She was greeted with polite enthusiasm, though the younger women still struggled to place her. Was she truly a guest of Mrs. Forsyth, or simply a kind-hearted spinster from St. Mary Mead, who always seemed to know more than she let on? No one thought much of Miss Marple, of course. They never did, until it was too late. The garden was abuzz with the typical conversations of small village life. Mrs. Armitage had finally convinced her son to stop racing his motorbike through the lanes. Reverend Chilton had declared the roof, repairs on St. Agnes complete, and there was a whisper going around that young Isabel Trench, the vicar's niece, had been seen walking arm in arm with Mr. Jack Colborne, the new chemist at Hatchley's Pharmacy. It was the sort of sunny afternoon where nothing dreadful could possibly happen. And then it did. It was Isabel herself who let out the first scream. Several heads turned. A few gasped. The music faltered. Had been walking by the edge of the garden near the old apple trees when she'd come upon something lying in the grass. She stood stock still, her hand covering her mouth. Others rushed over, and then someone exclaimed, "Oh, heavens, it's a child!" But it wasn't. Not quite. What lay on the grass, face down and twisted at an unnatural angle, was not a child at all, but a doll. A large one, dressed in a frilly blue frock, with straw-blonde curls and glassy blue eyes that stared up at the sky. What unsettled everyone wasn't the doll itself, but the fact that it had been carefully laid in a small wicker pram and set just under the tree in a patch of shade, as if watching the garden party, and around its neck, tied with a red ribbon, was a note. Detective Inspector Cray, who had been invited due to his wife's bridge club association with Mrs. Forsyth, stepped forward and peeled the note away delicately, his brows furrowed. "It's a nursery rhyme," he said slowly. "Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall." Silence swept over the gathering. There was something about the rhyme, so familiar and harmless in its usual context, that struck a jarring note now, written as it was in stark block letters. Then someone cried out again. It was one of the Forsyth maids, Lily, the doll, she said, her voice trembling. "That's not just any doll. That belonged to Miss Georgina." A murmur passed through the crowd. Georgina Forsyth. It had been nearly 2 decades since her name had been spoken aloud in polite society. Mrs. Forsyth's only daughter, found dead at the age of 10 at the foot of the nursery stairs. A terrible accident, they'd said, a tragic fall, but that doll had been buried with her. Everyone knew it, and now, here it was again. Back in Forsyth Hall, at the garden party, watching. Miss Marple did not speak. She merely stood very still, her eyes fixed not on the doll, but on Mrs. Forsyth herself, who had turned deathly pale and was now gripping the arm of her cane-backed chair with whitened knuckles. The party dissolved within the hour. No one dared to touch the doll. It was Detective Cray who arranged for it to be taken into the house under careful supervision, though even he seemed reluctant to hold it for long. Guests muttered excuses and filtered away, their conversations low and full of tension. Miss Marple lingered near the flower beds, seemingly fascinated by a patch of drooping hydrangeas. "I do hope, Mrs. Forsyth," she said at last, "that you'll forgive me the liberty, but I wonder if you recall the day Georgina's doll was last seen." Mrs. Forsyth did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on something far away, something none of them could see. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "It's strange, isn't it, how memories have a habit of returning just when one least expects them?" And without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked slowly down the gravel path, her steps measured, her mind already working. The doll had come back, but more importantly, so had the past. And Miss Marple knew better than most. When the past returns, it often does so with murder close behind. Chapter 2. The Whispering Village. In the days that followed the unsettling event at the garden party, Little Witchwood seemed to shrink inward. The usual neighbourly cheer gave way to watchful silences and half-finished sentences. No one quite said the word murder aloud, but it hovered nonetheless, unspoken and ever-present, like the autumn mist that now rolled in early across the fields. Miss Marple remained in the village under the pretence of visiting her old friend, Miss Henrietta Clegg, who lived in a modest ivy-clad cottage 2 doors down from the village green. Henrietta, though kind and prone to fits of forgetfulness, possessed an endless appetite for gossip, which Miss Marple found quite useful. Over tea and currant buns, she learned of every rumour currently bouncing through Little Witchwood like a game of lawn bowls. "They say someone broke into the mausoleum, Jane," Henrietta whispered, pouring tea with a shaking hand. "You remember the Forsyth mausoleum in St. Winifred's churchyard, where the family's all buried? The vicar told his wife that the lock was tampered with, and there was a footprint on the stone threshold." Miss Marple's expression remained politely interested. "Really? How troubling! But who on earth would wish to enter such a place?" Henrietta leaned in with relish. "They think it's a prank, or someone disturbed. That's the theory. But between you and me, it's no coincidence, is it? The doll, the rhyme, and now the crypt. It's like someone wants to rattle Mrs. Forsyth's bones." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Well, my dear, bones are such fragile things. Once disturbed, they do have a tendency to rattle for quite a while." Outside, the church bell rang for evensong, and Miss Marple excused herself for a walk, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She did not go to the church, but rather turned up the lane toward the green, where she expected she might find a more pointed conversation. She was not disappointed. Outside the post office, 2 figures stood in quiet conversation. Reverend Martin Chilton and young Isabel Trench, his niece. They fell into silence as Miss Marple approached, but not quickly enough. She had already caught the words Georgina and Stairs. "Good evening," she said pleasantly. "Miss Marple," the vicar greeted with a weak smile. "Quite the troubling business, isn't it?" "Indeed. she agreed. "I've just come from tea with Miss Clegg, who tells me the Forsyth family mausoleum was broken into." The vicar looked alarmed. "I'm afraid so. I was the one who found the disturbance. I noticed the door wasn't fully closed, the lock tampered with, I believe, but nothing appears to have been taken." "And how long has it been since the mausoleum was opened?" "Nearly 20 years. Not since the funeral of young Miss Georgina." Miss Marple turned her eyes to Isabel, who was clearly uneasy. "You were the one who found the doll at the garden party, weren't you, my dear?" Isabel nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, I thought it was a child at first. It must have given you quite a fright. It did. I keep seeing it in my dreams. The way it was looking up as if it knew something." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. "And what about the others at the party? Did anyone seem unusually affected?" Isabel hesitated. Mrs. Forsyth was certainly distressed, but then so was everyone. Miss Marple smiled gently. Of course. Well, do excuse me. I must post a letter." As they parted, Miss Marple stepped inside the post office and made a small purchase, enough to linger. Behind her, she heard the faintest exchange as the two resumed their conversation. "It's not just the doll," Isabel murmured. "It's the rhyme. I found another one, folded in my pocket." "Another rhyme?" the vicar whispered, horrified. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" "I was afraid," she replied, "afraid someone would think I'd done it." Miss Marple, buying her stamps, did not show that she had heard, but her mind was spinning. Another rhyme, folded into the pocket of the girl who had discovered the doll. No, this was no prank. This was deliberate. That evening Miss Marple paid a visit to Forsyth Hall. The great house was quieter now. The shutters on the east wing had been drawn, and several of the household staff were said to have left after the party, murmuring about bad omens and things better left buried. Mrs. Forsyth received her in the drawing-room, dressed in heavy black, though no new mourning had been declared. Her posture was stiff, her fingers wrapped around a delicate teacup that rattled gently against its saucer. "I don't know why you've come, Miss Marple," she said coolly. "The matter is being handled by Inspector Cray." "Oh, I've no intention of interfering," Miss Marple said gently. "I merely wished to offer my condolences. Seeing that doll again must have been terribly upsetting." Mrs. Forsyth gave her a sharp look. "I hadn't seen it in 20 years. It was buried with Georgina." "So I've heard. How peculiar that it should return." There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Forsyth said, "I've always believed someone pushed her." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "It was ruled an accident," Mrs. Forsyth continued. "But I've never been certain. There were tensions in the house back then, jealousies, secrets. My late husband was, well, a man of strong opinion, and my son, Edward, he and Georgina were never close." "Did she have any particular enemies?" Mrs. Forsyth gave a bitter laugh. "She was 10, Miss Marple. 10-year-old girls don't make enemies. But sometimes they see too much. Children notice things adults pretend aren't there." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is very true." As she left Forsyth Hall, walking out into the wind-blown dark, Miss Marple turned over everything she had heard. Doll, the rhyme, the disturbed mausoleum, the girl who had found the doll receiving another rhyme without explanation. And now Mrs. Forsyth's quiet confession. She had always believed her daughter's death was no accident. It wasn't the kind of thing one said lightly, which meant Miss Marple knew that the past had not returned to haunt Little Witchwood. It had never truly left. Chapter 3. Echoes Beneath the Ivy. Little Witchwood awoke the next morning cloaked in fog, a thick, low-hanging mist that curled like breath around hedgerows and crept over slate rooftops. It was the sort of morning, Miss Marple reflected, that made people uneasy, as if the village itself was holding its secrets more tightly. At the grocer's, the usual bustle was subdued. Conversation had turned almost reverent, as though the village itself had lost something precious. Though no one had officially declared young Georgina's death suspicious, the rumours had taken root once more like bindweed. Old wounds were being stirred, and it was clear the presence of that doll had shaken everyone far more than they cared to admit. Miss Marple paid for her small packet of tea and biscuits, offered a pleasant good morning, and stepped out just in time to see Inspector Cray stepping into the tobacconist's. He was a lean man with a military bearing and a heavy moustache, known more for his impatience than his insight. Miss Marple had met him once, years ago, in a matter involving missing pearls and a vindictive niece. He hadn't remembered her then, and she doubted he did now. Nevertheless, she followed him inside. "Inspector," she said pleasantly, causing him to glance up with vague recognition. "Oh, Miss Maple, is it?" "Marple," she corrected with gentle insistence. "From St. Mary Mead. I happened to be at the garden party." He gave her a stiff nod, already turning back to the tobacconist. "Unfortunate business, that. But nothing a bit of solid procedure can't sort. Trickery, probably. Someone with too much time on their hands." "You believe it to be a prank?" "Most likely. Villages like this are breeding grounds for drama. And grief, well, grief has a way of resurfacing in odd forms." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "Quite. Although I've always found that grief rarely returns without purpose." He glanced at her sideways but said nothing. Outside, she found herself walking toward the churchyard. It was not a place she frequented, but on a mist-veiled morning it felt as if the past itself had been peeled open, its contents fluttering close to the surface. She passed the lich gate and entered the older section of St. Winifred's, where time had softened the inscriptions on the stones. She knew where the Forsyth mausoleum stood, solid, square, and built of pale grey granite, with ivy spilling over its edges like weeping tendrils. To her surprise, she found the vicar there again, kneeling near the base of the door, with a small box of tools. "I thought the lock was tampered with," she said, her voice soft. Reverend Chilton jumped and turned with a sheepish smile. "Miss Marple, you startled me. I'm checking for damage. The lock is indeed compromised. I thought perhaps I might repair it myself." She knelt beside him, her shawl wrapped tightly about her. "And did you notice anything else unusual? About the threshold, perhaps?" He hesitated. "There were marks," he admitted, scuffing, as if someone had dragged something heavy across the stone, but no sign of entry inside. No broken seal, no objects disturbed within. Nothing I could see. He hesitated again, though, well, perhaps I imagined it, but I thought I heard a sound. "What sort of sound?" "A humming, very faint, like a lullaby. Miss Marple turned sharply. A lullaby? It must have been my imagination, the vicar added quickly. These old stones play tricks on one's hearing. She said nothing, though a crease appeared between her brows. As she rose to leave, she passed the older tombstones, stones that told of children lost to diphtheria, of entire lives lived and buried within 5 miles of this very hill. And as she did, she paused by the low headstone belonging to Georgina Forsyth. It was weathered but not forgotten. There were recent flowers at its base, white lilies slightly browned at the edges. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was not the blooms. It was the small paper tucked beneath them, a folded note. She looked around, saw no one, and picked it up with a gloved hand. It was written in a childlike hand, the letters crooked, the rhythm unmistakable. 3 blind mice ran up the stair. Only one was ever there. The second saw, but dared not say. The third was sent away. Miss Marple stood motionless. Then she folded the paper and tucked it into her handbag. Something stirred behind her, a faint crunch of gravel. She turned, but the mist revealed nothing. Back in the village, Miss Marple returned to Miss Clegg's for a late breakfast, and sat quietly through Henrietta's chatter about butter shortages and the Baker twins' scandalous proposal plans. But her mind was elsewhere. There had been a second rhyme, and now a third. Whoever had written them was not merely recalling an old trauma. They were reconstructing it, with purpose, with rhythm, as if reminding someone. Miss Marple excused herself just before noon and took a quiet walk toward the village school, which sat behind the orchard. Though she had no official reason to visit, she timed her arrival for the end of the morning session. Children poured out, laughing, tugging caps and scarves, chasing one another as only children could, unaware of shadows that moved just behind them. She spotted Isabel Trench, waiting by the gate, a book clutched to her chest, her eyes scanning the crowd nervously. Miss Marple approached her gently. "Isabel, my dear, might I trouble you for a moment?" The girl nodded, her face pale. "I found another rhyme," Miss Marple said softly. "At Georgina's grave." Isabel's eyes widened, and she looked down quickly. "They're warnings," she whispered. "That's what I think." "Who do you believe they're meant for?" Isabel hesitated. "Mrs. Forsyth, maybe Mr. Edward. I don't know. But someone wants the past remembered." Miss Marple studied the girl. "And do you remember it?" "I was only 7, she said, "but I remember the sound she made when she fell, that awful thud. And then silence, like everything had stopped breathing." Miss Marple touched her arm. "Some things stay with us longer than we realize." Isabel looked up, blinking back something unshed. "Do you believe it was an accident?" Miss Marple did not answer right away. Instead, she looked over the children laughing in the yard. "Accidents are curious things," she said at last. "They usually don't happen twice in the same household." The bell rang again, and the children were shepherded off. Isabel disappeared among them, her books still clutched tight. Miss Marple remained by the gate, watching until the school was quiet once more. And then, slowly, she turned toward the path home. The puzzle was tightening. Rhymes, graveyards, dolls, forgotten cries from the past. But someone in Little Witchwood remembered very well what had happened on those stairs 20 years ago, and now they wanted everyone else to remember too. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Drawing Room. By the following afternoon, the sun had pierced through the veil of mist, bathing Little Witchwood in a deceptive warmth. The village appeared restored to its ordinary rhythms, carts rattling over cobbled lanes, hens clucking in back gardens, and children skipping rope outside the sweet shop. Yet beneath the surface, unease still pulsed like a quiet drumbeat. At Forsyth House, the drawing-room had been opened once more, and Miss Marple, having received a polite but unexpected invitation, found herself seated near the hearth, a cup of thin Darjeeling in one hand, and her eyes subtly surveying the room. It was Edward Forsyth who had extended the invitation, though his mother, Lady Margaret, had seemed less than pleased when Miss Marple had arrived. Still, propriety prevailed, and she had received the guest with practised civility, her pale hands fussing unnecessarily with a handkerchief stitched in pale blue initials. Edward stood at the window, brooding and restless, while Isabel Trench sat stiffly on the sofa, her eyes downcast, her cup untouched. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Edward said after a pause. "You were at the garden party, I believe." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "a most charming affair, at least until the unfortunate discovery." Lady Margaret inhaled sharply, but said nothing. Edward turned to face her. "I've been told you have something of a reputation for insight, just a memory for human nature, Mr. Forsyth. It surprises people how little they remember of the way others behave." He offered a tight smile. "Then perhaps you can explain what happened here. Who would do such a grotesque thing?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, setting down her teacup. "Though I wonder if the real question is not who placed the doll, but why they believed it would be recognized at once." The room fell silent. Lady Margaret's fingers stilled. Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" "I understand the doll was Georgina's," Miss Marple continued. "Lost, or so it was thought, at the time of her accident." "That was never proven," Lady Margaret said sharply. "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But the mind of a child is rarely mistaken when it comes to attachments. Miss Trench, do you recall Georgina's affection for the doll?" Isabel started slightly. "Yes, she took it everywhere, and she called it Mousie, was it?" The girl nodded. Lady Margaret stood suddenly, her back ramrod straight. "I fail to see what relevance these nursery memories have." "Memories are curious," Miss Marple said gently. "They persist even when we attempt to bury them, particularly when they're never allowed to heal properly." There was another long silence. Then Edward spoke, quieter now. "You think this is someone's way of unsettling us? Reminding us of Georgina?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone believes there is a truth that was never told." At that moment, the butler, a stooped man named Harris, entered with a small silver tray. "Inspector Cray, to see you, sir." Edward looked up, surprised. "Show him in." The inspector entered briskly, his boots leaving slight marks on the polished floor. "Afternoon," he said. His tone was brusque, though his eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple with something resembling curiosity. "I've come with news," Cray said. "We've identified the handwriting on the note left at the grave. It matches samples from the village school written 20 years ago. Belonged to a child named Hannah Lytton. Miss Marple blinked. Hannah Lytton? She was a classmate of Georgina's. Moved away shortly after the accident. Her family left suddenly. Some sort of trouble. Edward's jaw tightened. I remember the name. She's returned, Cray continued. Living quietly at the edge of the village. Changed her surname. Runs a small flower shop under the name Miss Hargreaves. Miss Hargreaves! Lady, Margaret turned pale. I've bought lavender from her. Miss Marple sipped her tea. It seems she did not want to be recognised, and yet the notes at the grave and the nursery rhyme suggest she has not forgotten what happened. Cray crossed his arms. I'll be paying her a visit, though frankly, she's hardly a threat. We've no evidence she had anything to do with placing the doll. No, Miss Marple said quietly. But she may know something, or someone. Children see more than we think. As Cray turned to go, Lady Margaret sat down once more, her hand pressed to her temple. This is all terribly unnecessary. We cannot live our lives digging up ghosts. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, almost conversational. Sometimes, Lady Margaret, ghosts dig themselves up, especially when they've been buried alongside secrets. Outside, the clouds were gathering once again. A storm, perhaps, or merely a shift in the weather. But within the drawing-room of Forsyth House, the air had already changed. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Miss Clegg's, and excused herself early from supper, claiming fatigue. But in the privacy of her room, she sat by the window with her notebook open on her lap, pen tapping thoughtfully against her chin. She had written one name at the top, Hannah Lytton, alias Miss Hargreaves. Beneath it, she added, Georgina died, falling downstairs, doll presumed lost, now returned, nursery rhyme left at grave. Second rhyme appeared in church, third rhyme to come. Miss Marple had the distinct feeling the rhymes were building to something, not simply recollections, but a form of message, a puzzle with its final verse yet to be sung. She turned another page and wrote just one line. What did the second mouse see, but dare not say? And beneath it, in careful, looping handwriting, and who was sent away? She capped her pen and closed the notebook. Outside, the church bell tolled once, slow and distant. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and looked out into the darkening street. The past had returned to Little Witchwood, but it had not come quietly. Chapter 5. Shadows and Whispers. The next morning dawned with a grey stillness, as if the village itself held its breath. A low mist hung over the rooftops of Little Witchwood, curling through the narrow lanes and dampening the hedgerows. At the flower shop on the eastern edge of the high street, a small sign swung gently in the breeze. Miss Hargreaves. Fresh flowers, arrangements for all occasions. Inside, the air smelled of lilac and roses, though the woman behind the counter appeared far less delicate than her wares. Hannah Lytton, now Miss Hargreaves, was tall and angular, with sharply cut hair and deep-set eyes that flicked toward the door every time the bell rang. That morning, when it rang for the third time, it was not a customer, but Inspector Cray, who stepped inside, his presence all heavy boots and official silence. Miss Hargreaves, he said. She turned slowly. Yes? You may remember me, he said. I'm Inspector Cray. I'd like to speak with you about the Forsyth family. A pause. Of course, she said, though I've not had dealings with them in many years. You went to school with Georgina Forsyth, did you not? I did. Cray gestured to the counter. Mind if we sit? She looked at him with narrowed eyes, then nodded toward the small table near the window, where she often arranged violets into tiny glass vases. If you like. Once seated, Cray took out a folded slip of paper from his coat. Do you recognize this handwriting? Aya glanced at it and froze, then, just as quickly, looked away. I might, she said. It's been years. It's yours, Cray said flatly. From a school composition. Hannah hesitated. Yes, I suppose it is. Why did you leave that rhyme at the grave, Miss Hargreaves? She met his gaze without blinking. Because someone had to. Had to? Yes, she said, voice firm. Because it's not over. It was never over. Outside the wind picked up, scattering loose petals across the pavement. Care to explain that? Cray asked. But she only shook her head. You wouldn't understand. You weren't there. Cray frowned. Were you trying to frighten the family? Stir up the past? No, she said. I was trying to make them remember it. Elsewhere in Little Witchwood, Miss Marple sat in the parlour of Miss Clegg's guest house, threading yarn through a half-knitted scarf and listening to the distant toll of the church bell. Her thoughts were not on the scarf, nor even on the bell, but on a conversation she had overheard in the greengrocer's earlier that morning. Strange woman, that Hargreaves, said Mrs. Pettimore, sniffing over the apples. Never married, lives alone, always walking by the Forsyth place. I heard she used to be quite close to the girl who died, murmured another voice. Mrs. Linney, if Miss Marple recalled correctly. Georgina, wasn't it? And yet, added Mrs. Pettimore in a low tone, wasn't she the one they said saw what happened? At that, Miss Marple had paused by the cabbages, her ears sharpening. She did say something, Mrs. Linney continued, when the girl fell, but then her family moved away so suddenly. Suspicious, Mrs. Pettimore muttered. The whole lot of them. Now, back at the guest house, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. She reached for her notebook and jotted down a new thought. Hannah saw, but was silenced. There was a knock at the door. Miss Clegg peeked her head inside. Letter for you, Miss Marple. No return address. Curious, Miss Marple accepted the envelope. The paper was plain, and the handwriting unfamiliar. She unfolded it slowly and read, The second verse is coming. You'll hear it at dusk. But beware, some rhymes were never meant to be sung again. She sat back, thoughtful. A second verse. Was the first not enough? She recalled the lines from the first rhyme, now scrawled in her notebook. One mouse climbed where it should not tread. One mouse fell and cracked her head. Was the second verse to be equally grim? And who was sending them? She turned to the window. The village children had left their skipping ropes and dolls behind for the afternoon, retreating into warm kitchens and drawing rooms. The street was empty, save for a solitary figure walking up the path toward Forsyth House, Isabel Trench. Miss Marple stood. Moments later, she was out the door, coat wrapped tightly about her shoulders. Isabel Trench had not meant to return to Forsyth House, but her footsteps had betrayed her. She found herself at the edge of the gravel drive, looking up at the darkened windows. Something about the house made her stomach tighten. Something beyond the memories of Georgina, beyond the accident. She moved quickly, circling the garden, hoping no one inside noticed. Behind the house stood the old conservatory, mostly unused now. She paused there at the moss-covered glass and placed her hand against the door. Locked, but the scent of dried lavender wafted toward her, a familiar scent. She turned to leave and found Miss Marple standing several feet behind her. "Oh!" Isabel gasped. "You frightened me." "I do apologize," Miss Marple said kindly. "It seems we're both drawn here today." Isabel flushed. "I was just walking." "A thoughtful habit," Miss Marple said, "and yet it's curious how certain places draw us back." Isabel looked away. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you are." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple asked gently, "Did you ever truly believe Georgina's death was an accident?" Isabel hesitated. I was a child." Children often know more than they're allowed to say. At that, Isabel's face crumpled. "She didn't fall," she whispered. "She was pushed." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "By whom?" But Isabel shook her head. "I don't know. I was upstairs. I heard a scream, and then she was gone. And Hannah saw something. But she told me never to speak of it. Said it wouldn't bring Georgina back." "And so it was buried," Miss Marple said softly, "like so much in this village." Isabel nodded. "But someone doesn't want it buried any more." From the distance the church bell tolled again, this time 2 short chimes. And somewhere, faint and chilling, a child's voice began to sing. A second rhyme. 2 mice ran and one grew scared. One told none and never dared. Isabel clutched Miss Marple's arm. "I know that voice," she said faintly. Miss Marple did not ask whose it was. She already had a dreadful suspicion. Chapter 6. The Secrets Behind Lace Curtains. The following morning, Little Witchwood wore a subdued hush. The mist that had lingered the previous day had vanished, but a damp chill still clung to the stone cottages and hedgerows, as though the very earth held its breath. It was the kind of silence that invited secrets to be whispered and heard. Miss Marple sat in the parlour of Miss Clegg's guest house, with a pot of strong Darjeeling beside her, and her knitting basket untouched at her feet. A note lay folded on her lap, bearing a 3rd stanza of the eerie rhyme. 3 mice whispered near the gate. 1 stayed silent, sealed her fate. She read it twice, then a 3rd time. There was no postmark, no signature. It had been slipped beneath her door some time before dawn. 3 verses now, each one carefully constructed in metre and tone, not childish nonsense, but deliberate cryptic messaging. The sender had a gift for rhythm and menace. Miss Marple turned her eyes to the hearth, where the fire had burned low. She remembered a line her nephew Raymond had once written in a short story. "Children forget little, especially when what they see is too terrible to understand." Had Hannah, Isabel, and Georgina, 3 little girls, best friends once, witnessed something unspeakable? Or worse, been complicit in a web of guilt and silence? She glanced up as Miss Clegg entered, with a tray. "Bit of a chill still," the landlady said, setting down toast and jam. "Though I dare say we've all got a bit of cold in the bones lately, with all this nonsense about dolls and rhymes. Such grim things, nursery rhymes." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "the older ones often contain dire warnings, lessons dressed in rhyme, death and consequence wrapped up like a lullaby." Miss Clegg gave a shiver and crossed herself. "And to think," she muttered, "all this started with a tea party." At the rectory, Reverend Pinner stood before his congregation, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The pews were full for midweek service. Curiosity more than piety, he suspected. The Forsyth name was on everyone's lips, though few spoke it aloud. The vicar had known Georgina in passing years ago. A bright little thing, quick to laugh. The accident had cast a long shadow, one no sermon had ever lifted. After the service, he found himself drawn to the small table near the entrance where parishioners left notes and prayer cards. Among them was a folded slip of parchment, old and yellowing, tucked halfway beneath the collection tray. It was another rhyme. 4 mice danced around a fire. One stepped back, but saw the lyre. He turned it over. No signature, just a tiny drawing in the corner. 3 looping circles and a slash through the middle. Almost like a child's attempt at a coat of arms. He did not know what it meant, but he pocketed it all the same and, after much hesitation, sent for Miss Marple. By the time Miss Marple arrived, the vicar was pacing in the vestry. She entered quietly, greeted him with her usual gentle smile, and waited. He handed her the parchment. "A 4th verse," she murmured, smoothing the edge of the brittle page. "They're escalating." "You think there will be more?" Pinner asked. "I think we're not meant to stop at 5. He frowned. "Miss Marple, I must ask, do you believe these are threats?" "I believe they're memories, dressed as rhymes." She paused, running her fingers over the childish scrawl. "And someone is determined we all hear the story, whether we want to or not." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the far end of the village, where the cottages thinned and the trees grew denser. She carried with her a single posy of violets, plucked from Miss Clegg's garden. Her feet, though slow with age, found their way easily to the small graveyard behind St. Anne's Church. Georgina Forsyth's headstone sat near the edge, simple and grey. The name still clearly carved, Georgina Eloise Forsyth, 1993-2003. Forever in bloom Miss Marple knelt carefully, placing the violets beside a weathered toy bear someone else had left recently. She stayed there, silent, for some time, thinking, not of Georgina alone, but of the village itself. How tragedy could take root in such a quiet place, buried beneath layers of tea rituals, hedge gossip and lace curtains. Then a shadow passed behind her. "Miss Marple?" She turned to find Hannah Hargreaves standing at the path, arms crossed tightly. "I thought I might find you here," Hannah said. "I felt I should pay my respects." Hannah nodded, lips thin. It's hard seeing her name again, as if she might appear just around the corner, 10 years gone, and still it haunts everything. "You saw her that day," Miss Marple said gently. "Didn't you?" Hannah stiffened. "I told the police all I could. But perhaps not all you remembered." Hannah looked away. "I was 12, What could I have done? Children often notice what adults cannot. There was silence, broken only by the call of a magpie in the trees overhead. She was afraid, Hannah whispered finally. Before she died, the last week or so, she wouldn't say why. Said she'd found something out, something about her mother. Miss Marple frowned. Her mother? Yes, but I never knew what. Just that Georgina said she overheard something one night. Did she say where? Only that it was near the nursery, after supper. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the headstone. Secrets, then, behind closed doors, and overheard by a child. She rose slowly, brushing off her skirt. Thank you, Miss Hargreaves. You've helped more than you know. As she turned to go, Hannah's voice followed her. There'll be another rhyme tonight. I can feel it. Miss Marple didn't doubt it. What she feared, though, was that the next verse would no longer be a memory, but a warning. Section 7. A Whisper in the Willow. Walk by the end of the week, the village of Elmridge had ceased to whisper in cautious tones, and instead embraced full-throated speculation. Mrs. Webb's unfortunate fall had taken a back seat to the matter of little Clara Partridge, and the strange doll whose porcelain features now lay broken in the care of Inspector Cray. Some called it a mere accident, others a warning, but none could explain the faded scrap of cloth, nor why Clara's father, a quiet solicitor, looked as though he'd aged a decade overnight. Miss Marple, however, was not one to entertain idle gossip. She had spent the morning quietly knitting, in the shade of the old cedar in Reverend Cuthbert's garden, accepting a second cup of tea from his kind but flustered sister, Harriet. "You know, Miss Marple," Harriet Cuthbert said, placing the teapot down, "it's all so horrid. I can hardly bear to go near the willow walk these days." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Oh, I'd always thought the willow path to be rather soothing." Harriet gave a visible shudder. "Yes, it was, but I heard a sound the other day, like weeping, near the pond." Miss Marple said nothing, though her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Weeping? You're quite certain?" "Perfectly." Harriet leaned in. "I thought at first it was the wind, but no, it was a child's cry, very faint. When I turned to look, there was nothing, only the pond and the reeds. I rushed back home straight away." "Did you mention this to your brother?" "Oh, I couldn't possibly worry him with something so vague." Miss Marple murmured, setting aside her knitting. "Well, I think I shall take a stroll that way myself. A little air is just what one needs before lunch." She left soon after, declining the Reverend's offer of company. The willow walk curved just behind the old rectory garden, a gentle trail shaded by drooping boughs. It had once been the pride of the Cuthberts' mother, who insisted every spring that it be lined with narcissus. Now the path was a little overgrown, the stones mossy with neglect. Miss Marple walked slowly, her sensible shoes barely making a sound. The breeze stirred the leaves, and she paused by the pond, overgrown, stagnant, and oddly silent, and then she saw it. Near the edge, half hidden by a curtain of willow branches, was a scrap of cloth. Not unusual, save that it bore a curious stitch, pale blue thread in a looped M. She plucked it free and turned it gently in her hands. Not a child's garment, but something older, embroidered by hand. She slipped it into her pocket and turned, only to find herself face to face with Clara's older brother, Jonathan Partridge. He was watching her with a furrowed brow, one hand shoved into his coat pocket. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple," he said curtly. "Oh, and why ever not? It's not safe, not any more." Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look. "How very curious. I was just told the same thing. By your sister, in fact." His face went still. "Clara? She cried here not long ago, according to Miss Cuthbert. A child's weeping in the reeds. Now tell me, Jonathan, do you know why your sister might be frightened?" He looked away, jaw tight. "She's just a child. She imagines things. Children imagine truths adults dare not name." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked briskly away, the gravel path crunching beneath his boots. Miss Marple remained by the pond a moment longer, her gaze drifting across the surface. Beneath its stillness, something was buried. Not a body, perhaps, but a truth. Later that afternoon, Inspector Cray stood at the vicarage gate, his brow furrowed as Miss Marple approached. "I've come from speaking to the Partridges," he said grimly. "Clara's mother's been confined to her bed with a fever. The poor child hasn't spoken since the incident." "Not spoken at all?" He nodded. "Not a word. I brought in Dr. Ransom, but he says it's shock. Psychological, nothing physical. She's withdrawn." Miss Marple's fingers curled lightly around the handle of her basket. "Inspector, might I have a word with Clara?" Cray looked doubtful. "If you think it'll help." "I should very much like to try." They entered the Partridge home, a tidy but sombre place. Clara was in the drawing-room, curled in a chair, her face turned to the window. Her doll, now headless, lay beside her. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, not too close. "That's a very fine ribbon your doll was wearing," she said gently. "Blue suits her." No reply, but Clara's fingers twitched just once. "I once had a doll named Lizzie," Miss Marple went on, her voice soft. "She had a dress with little flowers on it, but one day I found her torn. Do you know who had done it?" Clara turned slightly, eyes wide. "My brother! He didn't mean to be cruel, of course, only frightened. He thought Lizzie had told me something." Clara blinked once. "I wonder, Clara," Miss Marple continued, "what did your doll hear? Did she see someone she wasn't supposed to?" A single tear slid down Clara's cheek. She pointed, not to the doll, but to the embroidery hoop on the far table. Miss Marple rose, crossed to it, and picked up the half-finished sampler. The initials were the same. M, stitched in the same blue thread as the scrap by the pond. "Did your mother make this?" she asked softly. Clara gave a trembling nod. Miss Marple's face remained calm, but inwardly her mind was moving rapidly. Blue thread, a broken doll. A child silenced not by trauma alone, but by fear. As she left the house, she glanced once more at the garden gate, where Jonathan Partridge stood watching her. This time it was not hostility in his eyes, but dread, and Miss Marple, prim as ever, smiled and nodded gently. The game, it seemed, had begun to shift. Section 8. Threads beneath the surface. By the following morning, the air in Elmridge had turned crisp, edged with the sharpness of approaching autumn. Miss Marple, ever punctual, sat once more on the bench near the vicarage garden, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm. but her mind was far from her stitches. Across the lane, Reverend Cuthbert greeted the milkman with his usual cheer, though his eyes held an unspoken tension. Elsewhere, the windows of the Partridge home remained shuttered. Clara, Miss Marple suspected, had not spoken again. It was time to prod the silence. She rose, shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders, and made her way to the village green, where Inspector Cray stood in conversation with Miss Templeton, the spinster schoolteacher who had once taught both Jonathan and Clara Partridge. And she was always a quiet child, Miss Templeton was saying, but bright, imaginative, if you know what I mean, sensitive to undercurrents. "Good morning," Miss Marple interjected politely. "So sorry to interrupt." Cray nodded, ever respectful. "Miss Marple, Miss Templeton was just telling me how Clara has always been a bit different." Miss Templeton adjusted her spectacles. "It's more than that. There's been a darkness in that household for years, ever since, well, after Mrs. Partridge's miscarriage." Miss Marple's brow creased faintly. "I wasn't aware she'd lost a child." "Oh, yes," Miss Templeton said, voice hushed. "Before Clara. A little girl. Stillborn, they said. But the Partridges were never quite the same. Mrs. Partridge took to bed, and Mr. Partridge, well, he took to his study. The only one who seemed to go on normally was Jonathan." Cray looked thoughtful. Odd that sort of grief could fester for so long. "Grief, or something else," Miss Templeton said, lowering her voice. "There's always been something unspoken in that house." Miss Marple, silent as ever, merely nodded. But her thoughts churned. A lost child, a mute girl, a broken doll, and a mother who lay ill and unseen. The nursery rhyme chant returned to her. Poor Polly went tumbling down the stair. She parted ways from the others and turned back toward the Partridge residence, but took a slower route, one that wound behind the garden hedges and toward the neglected greenhouse at the far end of their property. The gate was unlatched. Inside, dust lay thick across the old planting tables, and a smell of decay clung to the air. But in one corner, curiously out of place, stood a small wicker chair, child-sized. Beside it, a faded photograph in a cracked frame. Miss Marple brushed the dust from the glass and peered in. 2 children. One was unmistakably Jonathan, perhaps 9 or 10. The other was not Clara, but another girl, older than an infant, dressed in blue. The same eyes, the same sad expression. She heard a creak behind her, and turned to find Mr. Partridge himself standing in the doorway, his face pale, mouth set in a thin line. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "I believe I was expected," she answered gently. His eyes flicked to the photograph in her hands. "That was Marion, our first daughter. Not stillborn, then?" His face twitched. "No, she lived 2 years, died in a fall down the cellar stairs." A tragic accident. He nodded once, but the gesture was too mechanical, too rehearsed. Miss Marple replaced the frame on the bench. "And Clara? Has she ever spoken of Marion?" He shook his head. "She doesn't know." "No, but I believe she remembers." Partridge gripped the doorframe. "You don't understand." "I understand the deep weight of guilt, Mr. Partridge," she said softly, "and what it can do to a household. How it lingers in the walls, settles into the corners like mildew." He said nothing. I also understand that children often see more than we give them credit for, she added, especially little girls with dolls. Dolls who are witnesses to things never spoken aloud. There was a long silence, broken only by the creaking of the greenhouse's rafters in the wind. Finally, Partridge stepped aside. "You should leave, Miss Marple." She did, but not before noting the faint stain beneath the wicker chair, a rusty brown patch on the floorboards, long since dried. That afternoon, Clara sat by the window once more. Miss Marple returned, this time with a small book of nursery rhymes. "Would you read with me?" she asked softly, opening to a page, with delicate illustrations. Clara didn't respond, but her eyes flicked downward. Miss Marple began in a warm, almost sing-song voice. Poor Polly went tumbling down the stair, and no one heard, and no one cared. Clara blinked. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Miss Marple turned the page. She lay so still at the bottom step, eyes wide open, no more breath. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She pointed again to the same embroidery hoop. Miss Marple smiled gently. "You stitched that for her, didn't you? For the doll that wasn't really yours." A single nod, and then Clara whispered, "It was Jonathan." Miss Marple left the house and walked straight to the constable's station, her steps brisk and sure. Inspector Cray, sensing the storm she carried, stood before she reached his desk. "Miss Marple, we must speak privately," she said, firmly. Cray gestured her in, and as the door closed behind them, Miss Marple folded her hands. "It is time, Inspector, that you searched the old cellar steps at the Partridge home." Cray frowned. "Why?" "Because somewhere between memory and silence a child fell once, and her brother made sure it happened again." Section 9. The Cellar Steps. Inspector Cray was not a man easily swayed by hunches, but Miss Marple's expression left no room for doubt. The kind of quiet certainty she wore did not invite debate. It simply insisted. And so, within the hour, Constable Evans and Cray himself stood outside the Partridge residence, the front gate swinging lazily in the breeze, its iron hinges groaning faintly like a voice long unused. Jonathan Partridge answered the door, his usual polished calm still intact, though his fingers twitched ever so slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. "Inspector," he said with a forced smile, "Miss Marple didn't waste time, I see." "I'd like to see your cellar," Cray said plainly. Jonathan hesitated, just for a beat. Of course, the house was silent, eerily so. Clara, it seemed, had been taken by Nurse Hensley for a walk. Mrs. Partridge remained sequestered in her room. A low ticking from the grandfather clock was the only sound as Jonathan led them down the back corridor, past the kitchen. "The steps are narrow," he remarked. "Watch your footing." He pulled open a creaking door that revealed a steep, shadowed stairwell. The scent was old and earthy, mildew and memories. Cray lit a lantern, and they descended. The walls were rough stone, and cobwebs laced the ceiling beams. But it was the fourth step that caught Cray's eye. It was splintered along one side, as if something heavy had struck it long ago. At its base, a discoloured patch marred the stone floor. Evans crouched beside it. "Sir, this isn't new." Cray nodded. "But it's blood." Jonathan stood at the top of the stairs, silent. Miss Marple, who had joined them quietly at the entrance, tilted her head. It was Marian, wasn't it? Not an accident, not quite. Jonathan didn't answer, but his face gave him away. Cray rose slowly. "Mr. Partridge, you told us your sister died in her sleep." "That was the story," Jonathan said, voice distant. "It's what they wanted to believe." "And Clara?" Miss Marple asked. "You saw her beginning to remember, didn't you? That's why you took her doll. That's why you harmed it." Jonathan laughed once, short and sharp. "That doll was dangerous. You think it's just a child's toy, but she gave it everything. Her memories, her grief, her fear." "She gave it a name," Miss Marple said. "Polly. The same name from the rhyme. The rhyme she heard as a little girl, when Marian fell." "I was 10, he said suddenly. "She was crying. I told her to go away. She wouldn't. She said she'd tell Mother what I did to the kitten." His eyes were wild now. "So I pushed her, just a little." Silence fell like a curtain. Cray looked at Miss Marple. She met his gaze solemnly, then turned back to Jonathan, and Clara saw. He didn't deny it. The formal questioning that followed was meticulous, but it hardly mattered. Jonathan's confession had unravelled with chilling clarity. The tragedy of Marian Partridge had never left the house. It had settled like dust in the corners, absorbed into the stitching of a doll, and finally surfaced in the quiet defiance of a child who had refused to forget. Mrs. Partridge, confronted with the truth, descended deeper into a kind of catatonic shock. She neither wept nor spoke, but her hands shook for days. Nurse Hensley, pale and silent, stayed on longer than expected, tending not only to the mother, but now to the daughter, who had begun tentatively to hum again. It was not quite singing, but it was a beginning. A week later, the village had begun its slow return to rhythm. The grocer stopped whispering. Mrs. Beale held a flower show. The church bells resumed their gentle chimes. Miss Marple sat once more on her bench, knitting in hand, but her eyes were turned towards the vicarage garden, where Clara played quietly under the watchful eye of Nurse Hensley. "She's mending," Reverend Cuthbert said as he approached. "Strange how children carry such weight without a sound." "Children are great observers," Miss Marple replied, not looking up. "They may not always speak, but they feel and remember, often more clearly than adults." He nodded. "And what of justice? Will prison heal any of them?" "Justice isn't always punishment, Reverend," she said softly. "Sometimes it's truth. Sometimes it's simply the light shining in a dark room for the first time in years." She turned the page of her knitting pattern. "There are so many kinds of sorrow," she said, "but the worst is the kind that silences." And with that, Miss Marple began a new row of stitches, as the wind stirred the branches above. Section 10. The Reflection Beneath the Rosebush. The roses at the edge of the vicarage garden had begun to bloom early that year, their soft petals flushed with spring colour. A contrast, Miss Marple thought, to the lingering shadows that still hovered over the Partridge household. And yet, life in St. Mildred's was resuming its familiar rhythm. Murmurs of the scandal still drifted through tea-rooms and hedgerows. But as ever, the village possessed a curious talent for smoothing over jagged truths with politeness and pastries. On a gentle Thursday morning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage for tea. Clara was seated on a tartan blanket beneath the apple tree, a new doll in her arms, clean, dressed in lace, and smiling with stitched serenity. Nurse Hensley, no longer with the partridges but remaining nearby, sat knitting quietly beside her. The child looked up when she saw Miss Marple, a trace of brightness now in her gaze. "She named the new one Polly too," Nurse Hensley said in a low voice. "I asked her why." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And?" she said, "It's not a scary name any more. Polly helped me remember." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. Children often understand more than we give them credit for, perhaps more than they should. Inside, the Reverend had laid out a modest tea service, lemon biscuits, seed cake, and, at Miss Marple's request, a small pot of orange pekoe. As he poured, he spoke with the soft tones of a man who had buried his share of truth behind scripture and sermons. "You always seem to see past what others miss," he said. "How did you know, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "It was the doll, Reverend, or rather, what had been done to it. Children may be rough with toys, but tearing a doll's head and soaking it, that's not childish anger. That's fear." Clara was frightened of what the doll remembered. The Reverend blinked. The doll remembered? "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea. "Children often displace their own trauma into their toys." Clara knew on some level that she'd seen something awful, something no child could fully understand. But as she grew older, the memories surfaced, fragmented, unclear, and so she acted them out. "By harming the doll," Miss Marple nodded, "by trying to silence it, just as her uncle had tried to silence her." He sat back slowly, eyes wide with the weight of unspoken horror. "You believe Jonathan would have harmed her?" he asked, almost not wanting to hear the answer. "I believe he already had," she said. "Not with his hands, perhaps, but with silence, with the manipulation of memory. He convinced everyone Marion had simply fallen, that Clara was imagining things, but the doll kept whispering the truth." Reverend Cuthbert fell silent. The ticking of the clock on the mantel became the only sound in the room. After a while, he asked, "And Mrs. Partridge?" Miss Marple's expression softened. Somewhere deep inside, I think she knew, but knowing something terrible and saying it aloud are not the same. She lived behind the illusion of her perfect home, her perfect son, and when Clara broke that illusion, it nearly broke her. She looked out the window. Clara was arranging a tea party for her doll now, carefully placing imaginary cups and saucers, her fingers moving with newfound calm. "She'll recover," Miss Marple said, "because she's been allowed to speak at last." The Reverend offered another biscuit, and the conversation drifted to parish matters, the flower show, and the upcoming spring fete. As the sun angled lower in the sky, Miss Marple rose to take her leave. Out in the garden, Clara looked up again. She held out her doll without a word. Miss Marple crouched beside her. "She's looking very well, Polly is," she said kindly. "She seems quite safe now." Clara nodded. "Do you think she remembers?" the girl asked. Miss Marple looked into the child's solemn eyes. "I think she remembers enough, and that's what makes her strong." The girl smiled, a real one at last, and returned to her tea party. As Miss Marple walked back through the winding lanes of St. Mildred's, past ivy-covered cottages and chimneys puffing gentle smoke. She thought of the many kinds of wounds people carried, the hidden, the denied, the forgotten. The village would forget in time, of course. They always did. But for those few who remembered, Clara, Nurse Hensley, perhaps even Mrs. Partridge, it would be a quiet, steady healing. And as she reached her own gate and opened it with its familiar creak, she paused just a moment. She looked back over her shoulder toward the hills rising behind the village, where the air carried the scent of spring and the promise of stillness. Miss Marple had solved another crime, but more importantly, a silence had been broken, and in that there was peace. Section 11. Miss Marple's Final Test. The quiet hush of the late afternoon had fallen over Heatherfield, and the village wore its usual veil of calm. Yet beneath that ordinary stillness, tensions ran taut like the strings of a violin. The gossip had ebbed only slightly since the previous day's funeral, and though the constable continued to make his rounds, it was common consensus that the police were no closer to solving the death of little Emily Gage than they had been on the day her doll was found, forsaken and broken on the green. Miss Marple, however, had reached her own conclusions, or rather, she was nearly there. The pieces had arranged themselves in her mind like a half-finished jigsaw, with one vital sliver still missing, and so, in the parlour of the vicarage that evening, over a modest tea of cucumber sandwiches and lemon sponge, she issued a quiet but deliberate invitation. "I do believe, Vicar," she said to Reverend Clem, "that we ought to host one final gathering at the parish hall, a little memorial for Emily, nothing too formal. It might do the village some good to come together and reflect, and as it happens, it may help us make sense of what remains unclear." The vicar looked at her with a faint flicker of recognition behind his eyes. He had learned by now not to question Miss Marple's seemingly innocent suggestions. "A splendid idea, Miss Marple. I shall make the arrangements immediately." And so, 2 evenings later, the parish hall glowed with candlelight once more. It was a smaller affair than the fete, subdued and respectful. Tea was served, chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and at the far end of the room, propped up on a small easel, was a framed photograph of Emily Gage, one taken the previous summer at the Harvest Fair. She looked cheerful, her dark plaits bouncing, a blue ribbon in her hair. The villagers came, out of respect, out of guilt, or out of curiosity. Mrs. Redmond, grim and quiet, her son Victor hovering at her side, Miss Pilling, eyes flitting anxiously between every movement, Mr. Andrew Gage standing stiffly apart from the others, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, and Constable Lorimer, seated near the fire, watching them all. When everyone had settled, Miss Marple rose and began to speak, softly, with the mild authority that always commanded attention. "It is a sorrowful thing to lose a child," she began. "Emily was bright, inquisitive, and kind-hearted. One cannot help but wonder how such a little soul could come to harm in a village such as ours. And yet, sometimes tragedy is not born of strangers or wickedness, but of pain, long carried and unspoken." There was silence. Some looked to the floor. A few glanced at Andrew Gage. "I have lived in St. Mary Mead for many years," Miss Marple went on, "and I have learned that people are not always what they appear. There are secrets, often painful ones, buried beneath politeness and routine. Emily, I believe, knew something she ought not to have known, and she confided it in someone she trusted. That child was wise enough to sense when something was amiss, but not quite old enough to understand the danger. She allowed the words to sink in, casting her gaze over the group. Then she turned to Victor Redmond. "You told me once, Victor, that Emily had shown you something curious behind the vicarage garden, something she found buried. But when I asked again, you changed your answer. Why?" Victor shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple's eyes held his. "It does matter, Victor, because I believe Emily found something she wasn't meant to see." Victor looked down. His mother, beside him, whispered sharply, "Say nothing, Victor." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "Mrs. Redmond, you're very protective of your son. I quite understand. But what Emily found was not your doing." There was a soft gasp from the crowd. Miss Pilling had gone, pale. I believe Emily discovered a small pouch, cloth or leather likely stained, buried in the flower bed, and inside it were tablets, very specific ones. Mr. Gage let out a strangled sound, but Miss Marple continued. "Tablets used to treat certain nerves, ones prescribed, I believe, to your lodger, Miss Pilling." The room turned. "No!" Miss Pilling clutched her shawl tighter. I only ever— You were frightened she'd speak," Miss Marple said, still softly. "Frightened she'd tell someone you'd buried the medication rather than taking it. Because if the doctor found out, he'd report it, and you'd be sent away again." Miss Pilling's hands trembled violently. "Emily saw. She saw you dig the hole. She asked you questions. Perhaps she even joked that she'd tell someone." I didn't mean to." Miss Pilling began to sob. "She followed me into the woods, and I only meant to frighten her. Just a scare. Nothing more, but she ran. She tripped. I heard the crack and— Oh, God!" Gasps echoed through the room. The vicar bowed his head. Mrs. Redmond turned her face away. Miss Marple said nothing more. There was no triumph in her voice, no gloating, only quiet certainty. It was Constable Lorimer who rose and stepped toward Miss Pilling, who by then had crumpled to the ground. "Miss Marple," he said afterward, "you always said it would come to light." She gave a small smile. "It always does. In a village, the truth doesn't stay buried for long, not with so many watching eyes and listening ears." And as the villagers slowly dispersed, their expressions subdued, Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders, her gaze lifting once more to the darkened windows of the vicarage. The final pieces had fallen into place. Only the aftermath remained. Section 12. The aftermath in Heatherfield morning light spilled over Heatherfield like a balm, gilding the rooftops and filtering gently through the hedgerows. The storm had passed, both literal and metaphorical, and the village, ever resilient, began to resume its quaint rhythms. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The death of young Emily Gage and the quiet, devastating revelation of Miss Pilling's guilt had left a scar, one not easily spoken of, nor easily healed. Miss Marple sat in her garden, pruning roses with her customary gentleness, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She had, after all, seen such darkness before, more than the average soul would care to imagine. It never grew easier, but she had learned the value of acceptance, of grace in the face of the inexplicable cruelty that sometimes took root even in the most idyllic corners of the world. It was there that Dr. Hayward found her. He paused by the gate, hat in hand, and gave her a rueful smile. "You were right all along, Miss Marple," he said as he stepped into the garden, "though I doubt the constable will ever admit it." "I wouldn't expect him to," Miss Marple replied without malice. "He means well, but men often look in the wrong places when it comes to matters of the heart and mind." He took the seat she offered him and watched as she snipped a fading bloom. "I'd treated Miss Pilling for her anxiety," he said after a long silence. "She was improving, or so I believed. I had no idea she was discarding the tablets." "You couldn't have known," Miss Marple said softly. "Shame often leads people to dangerous concealments. Miss Pilling feared the label of madness more than the illness itself. And poor Emily." He trailed off, unable to continue. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sombre. She only wanted to understand. Curiosity in a child is a natural, beautiful thing, but it can also be terribly perilous. She stumbled into a secret, and Miss Pilling, in her fear, acted with tragic impulsiveness. A robin chirped from the hawthorn tree, punctuating the silence that followed. Dr. Hayward looked toward the village green, where children were beginning to gather again, tentative, subdued, but playing all the same. "It's difficult to know what to say to the Gages," he murmured. "They've lost everything." "Then perhaps say nothing at all," Miss Marple replied. "Simply be near. Some griefs cannot be softened by words." There was a pause before she added, "In time, Andrew Gage may find purpose again, and his wife, well, she was broken long before Emily's passing. Perhaps now, with the weight of secrecy lifted, she can begin to mend." Dr. Hayward looked at her with a mixture of admiration and awe. "You see so much that others miss." Miss Marple gave a small shrug, setting her shears aside. "Oh, not genius, Doctor, just attention. People will always tell you who they are, if you're patient enough to listen." The next week brought further change to Heatherfield. Miss Pilling, escorted by Constable Lorimer, was taken to a quiet facility near Exeter, where she would receive the care she had long resisted. The parish, sombre but relieved, came together once more, this time in silent understanding rather than judgment. Mrs. Redmond and her son, shaken by the events, began to keep a lower profile. It was said Victor had taken to visiting the churchyard more frequently, often placing a single blue ribbon by Emily's stone. And as for Miss Marple, she returned to her lacework, her garden, and her occasional teas with the vicar, who now looked at her with new reverence. The village would go on, just as it always did. But those who had watched Miss Marple's quiet, decisive unravelling of the case would never again underestimate the old lady in the pink shawl with the kindly smile and razor-sharp mind. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the thatched rooftops, Miss Marple penned a short letter to her nephew Raymond in London. It read, "My dear Raymond, Heatherfield has been most eventful of late. I won't bore you with the particulars, but suffice it to say that one should never ignore the significance of a child's curiosity, or a doll left in the wrong place. I do wish you'd visit soon. The roses are quite lovely this year. Affectionately, Aunt Jane." and with that she sealed the envelope, poured herself a cup of tea, and resumed her knitting. Another mystery solved, another sorrow laid bare. But the world, as always, kept turning.